Good morning, everybody. Great talk, Jacob. It's going to be a tough act to follow, but at least I'm not talking about geopolitics. I'm going to talk about weather, which some might argue is even harder than geopolitics. As I found out last night at dinner, some of you may have heard me before and didn't associate the name with the voice that you hear on your local radio station. A lot of folks, these smaller radio stations, do pick up our stories from USDA radio. We just had a retirement in the USDA radio office. Gary Crawford retired after 50 years with USDA, 1974 to 2024. So he hung it up, and now with the hiring freeze in the federal government, they can't fill that position. So right now we're down to Rod Bain in the USDA radio office. So you're going to be hearing Rod for a while until we can get some more people back into that office. They're down 2 at this point. So since some of you, again, may have heard me, but can't put the face with the voice, I'll just give myself a quick introduction. I was born in West Virginia, so a little bit different look to the land than what you have here in North Dakota. And people ask, how in the world, I'm not a farmer, but how did I end up in agricultural meteorology? And I think the root of that is that my grandparents were specialty crop farmers in southern West Virginia. And although we did not have day-to-day activities associated with that farm, we lived elsewhere, we were exposed to that a lot in our childhood. And so I was exposed to quite a bit of agriculture, didn't even think I really knew it at the time. Eventually, I knew I wanted to get into meteorology, so I went to Penn State, which at the time was the premier school, still is really, for meteorology in the eastern United States. When I came out, I was trained as a forecaster. I have never been a forecaster in my professional life. I started out in satellite meteorology. I went to the Climate Prediction Center for 8 years. But when a job opened up at USDA in the late 90s, I jumped at it, and I've been there ever since in the office of the chief economist. I also picked up some responsibilities in the late 90s that involved the brand new, at that time, U.S. Drought Monitor. I became one of the 6 original authors of that product. I'm one of 2 of the 6 originals still drawing the lines for the U.S. Drought Monitor. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. So again, just to give a little bit of background here, I'm told that if you take West Virginia, that crumpled up piece of paper that's West Virginia, smooth it out, it's actually bigger than the state of North Dakota, or so I'm told. It's a very hilly area, and the place where my grandparents' farm was, the land rose pretty sharply to the west and south and fell pretty sharply to the east and north. And they were perched pretty far up into the mountains. And that's today's image of what was the Chase farm. After my grandparents passed away, it was passed to one of my mom's brothers. He ran the farm until he passed away. And then none of my cousins wanted the farm, so it was sold out of the family in 2007. That farmhouse was built in 1870. So by the time the Great Depression rolled around, it was already 60 some odd years old. That's the house that I remember from my childhood. You can see the slope of the land. That's to the south there on one side, and it fell off pretty sharply as you went to the east and north. My grandparents, that was 13 years after they got married and had four children. I love the corn shocks in the background there. That was how they dried their corn down at that time. Not much mechanization at that time, obviously, in the 30s and 40s. As the years rolled by, the farm operation continued. I tell people that they were kind of the original farm-to-table movement before that was even a thing. They grew mostly specialty crops, a lot of vegetables and fruits. There wasn't much land to work with. They grew enough wheat and hay to keep the animals going, but for the most part, it was specialty crops. More than once as a child, they would send us up into the cherry trees with a bucket, picking cherries, or going out to the garden to get strawberries or snap beans. So we did do that for them when we were there, but good memories. Then the grandchildren started rolling in. I was born in the 60s. That's me with my grandmother there on the right. And then as the family continued to grow, a lot of gatherings over the years. One thing in that right-hand photo, notice that there was never a down moment. If you were taking care of family or taking care of the farm, there was never an idle moment. Obviously, it was a church Sunday. You can tell how everybody's dressed there in that 1970 image. But both my grandparents are peeling apples in that picture. So they were probably getting ready for lunch. And so they probably had to pull them out of the kitchen to come out for the family photo, but they continued to work right through the photo. My grandmother's peeling apples, grandfather's got a knife in his hand. So that is farm life as I grew up in the 60s and 70s. All right, enough about that. I am talking about weather, I promise. Last time I was in North Dakota, it was at the behest of the Red River Farm Network. They had me out for the Big Iron Farm Show about a year and a half ago. Had a good time with Don Wick and his crew. And it rained while we were talking, and you couldn't hear yourself think with that rain pounding down on the roof. Other than that, it was a fantastic visit there, late summer of 2023. All right, I am getting into the weather now after that introduction. And I do want to talk about sort of the gorilla in the room, and it's kind of a boogeyman in the sense of talking about changing weather, changing climate. But it's something that if you don't acknowledge and recognize in your farm operations, you're just going to give the advantage to somebody else. So we do have to acknowledge that weather changes, climate does change. We're not going to talk about causes or things like that or where we're going from here, but there have been some changes in my lifetime. You guys, a lot of you older than me, you've recognized that there's been some significant changes in weather and climate patterns over time. So this is North Dakota average temperature during we'll call it the warm season, April to September, going all the way back to 1895 to present. And I've highlighted some of the real warm years or the real warm growing seasons and the real cold growing seasons. Unfortunately, we don't have a whole lot of folks left that remember the Great Depression era, the 1930s, the Dust Bowl era. But for many, many years, 1936 stood as the warmest, hottest growing season on record. That was finally broken in 1988. And since then, we've had a number of rather hot years, whether it be 2006, 2012, and most recently 2021. 2024 was pretty warm, but it wasn't in record territory. But then there's some cold years too. The most recent really chilly year, growing season we had was 2004. Before that, 92 and 93 were unusually chilly, right after Mount Pinatubo and during the year of the flood in 93. There was a real cool stretch in the mid-60s, and there was another cool stretch in the early 50s, 50, 51. One thing I want to point out is that during the actual growing season, North Dakota, this is specific to North Dakota, has been relatively immune from warming during the growing season. I threw a trend line on there for the last 50 years, 1975 to 2024. You notice that the warming is only about a half a degree over the last 50 years, or about a degree per century of warming rate. So the overall warming has not been during the growing season, which is kind of interesting. That's not true everywhere, but it's certainly true in this part of the country. Now, if you look at October to March, we'll call that the cold season, the warming has been much more pronounced, on the order of over 2 degrees or over 4 degrees per century of warming that has taken place in that October to March timeframe. And I lived in Wisconsin for a couple of years when I was younger, in the 70s. Those were really cold winters, and so we have kind of clawed our way out of that. We still have cold winters from time to time. 96, 97 was a memorable one. 2013, 2014 was memorable. We've had a couple others since then. But we've had that trend of warmer winters overall. Again, tremendous ups and downs from year to year. But the trend certainly is warmer for the winters than during the summers, a much steeper trend line. I'm going to parse it down a little bit more and look at high and low temperatures, except this time I'm going to take it the whole calendar year. So we're looking at maximum temperatures only, calendar year, January to December. And again, you don't see a whole lot of remarkable warming in the last 50 years during the daytime. The overall trend is about a degree warmer over the last 50 years. You still get your noticeable spikes, 87, 88, 2006, 2012, 2021, still stick out like a sore thumb. And then you've got some of those really cool years like 96, or 2019, the year of the flood. Look at that 1950-51 also, how chilly it was for the maximum temperatures that calendar year. But again, that overall trend, last 50 years, just 1 degree warmer. But look at the nighttime temperatures. This is where you can really see that change. We have warmed at a rate of 2 degrees over the last 50 years at night, 4 degrees per century if you extrapolate it over 100 years. And you can see how it's rare to even have nighttime temperatures for an annual basis actually below the 20th century trend anymore. It doesn't happen very often. Last time we were substantially below that was 1996. If you go back to the early first half of the 20th century, it was routinely much, much cooler at night. Focused a lot on temperature. What about the precipitation patterns? Once again, there's huge year-to-year variability. You get these big highs, big wet years, and then incredibly dry years. Look at the difference between 2019 and 20. 21 was a drought year, so we have these huge spikes. Overall trend is not that great for North Dakota. We've only seen it get a little over an inch wetter over the last 50 years, 1.4 inches or so. So in spite of these spikes all over the place, you draw a trend line through it, and the overall trend is not that remarkable. One thing that has changed, we can blame some on the climate and some on human activities, is how the Red River spikes or the Red River flooding occurs. If you look, other than 1882 and 1997, flooding was very uncommon in the Red River Valley during the first half of the 20th century. Look at those peak flows. Again, this 1897 was before this, 1882 was before the records were kept. But there was really no year where we had a flow of 10,000 cubic feet per second all the way up until we got to 1943. Then we had 52, and then we had the 10-year floods, 69, 79, 89, all pretty bad floods in the valley. And that brought us to 97. It broke the 10-year cycle, but if you are from here and lived through it, nobody will ever forget 1997, the year of the flood, the year Grand Forks flooded and downtown burned. And then since then, we've had a pretty high frequency of flood events, spring flood events in the Red River Valley, 2001, 2006, 9 and 11. But as the defenses have been bolstered, it's reduced the impact to some degree. And so some of that with the building is, when you constrict the flow of the river, that is going to obviously bring the river up, the runoff's going to increase, and as that water flows northward, it can increase the risk of ice jam flooding and so forth. But you talk to somebody 100 years ago, and they're like, what Red River flood? Of course, Devil's Lake was a lot lower then too, so it was just a drier time overall. A lot of factors play into the Red River flooding. One of those is snowfall, and this is just specific to Fargo here, so it's not the entire basin. But you can see from the 50s and 60s on through the 90s, we did see a pretty sharp increase in snowfall accumulations in Fargo. Not every big snowfall year leads to a flood, but if the timing of everything with the melt-off and so forth is just right, it can lead to big flooding. Look at 1997. That's actually the winter of 96, 97. All-time record snowfall in Fargo and elsewhere in the valley. The way it melted off, it pushed everything to new heights for the time. 2009, 2011, no stranger. But then 2023, winter of 2022-23, a pretty big snowfall year, but no significant flooding. So it does depend on antecedent conditions like soil moisture and other factors. So you can't just go a one-to-one correlation, but certainly snowfall does have an impact. I do have 1897 on there, so the 1897 flood obviously at the time was a snowfall record for the season. Days with heavy precipitation. Again, I'm focusing on Fargo here just to kind of streamline everything. Back in the early part of the 20th century, late 19th century, there was actually a lot of days with heavy precipitation at Fargo. That kind of trailed off through the Dust Bowl era, the 40s, the 50s. Since then, we've seen a few years, 1998, 2007, 2019, where we've seen over 20 days with half an inch of moisture. But the overall trend there is not that impressive. So unlike other parts of the country, we haven't seen a dramatic increase in heavy precipitation days. I will be getting into the growing season soon, but I did want to show one more slide here that especially the soybean folks might find interesting. You know this, but it's kind of interesting to see it in graphical format. When I came into USDA in the late 90s, the state was just topping 1 million acres for harvested soybean acreage for the first time. Soybeans were basically an afterthought from the beginning of time through World War II, through the 60s, the 70s. Started to see an increase in acreage in the 80s. But who would have imagined if you were starting farming in the 50s or 60s that that's how many soybean acres would be harvested in North Dakota today? Part of that's technological improvements. Part of it is a warmer climate. There's a number of factors leading into that. But if you could have seen that coming, wow, that's quite an exponential increase in soybean acreage. Now we've seen over 7 million acres harvested a couple of times. Truly remarkable to see the adjustment to change that you folks are able to produce. All right, speaking of soybeans, I'm going to talk about the 2024 growing season. So I'm going to show a series of charts. Cropping areas are shown here. These are internal graphs that we use, or charts that we use at USDA. Major areas, 75% of U.S. production are dark green. Minor areas, 24% of U.S. production, light green. So you add up the dark green, light green, that's 99% of your national production. And then the yellow numbers indicate from the 2022 census what percentage of that is contributing to the national production. So North Dakota coming in 5% of the U.S. soybean production. Obviously, most of the acreage in the valley or the southeast. Well, let me go back for just a second. Oh, went the wrong way, sorry. So for 2024, the U.S. yield hurt by late drought was up marginally, a fraction of a percent. North Dakota, compared to 2023, up almost 6%, despite the development of some dryness and drought late in the growing season. If you look at the state-by-state numbers, probably can't see the specific numbers from there, but if you see the shading in blue, that was an improvement from 2023. If you see the reds and pinks, that's a decline from 2023 yield. You can see North Dakota actually, obviously, up 5.6%. Neighboring South Dakota down a little bit, a little worse as you move east. And then what really trimmed the yield was the drought in the eastern Corn Belt into parts of the Mid-South. Really untimely heat there, late summer drought. And that took the top off of what had been expected to be a pretty good national crop. If you look at sunflowers, and I was talking to some folks about that last night, huge cut in acreage for 2024. U.S. yield down 6.5%. North Dakota yield down more than 12%. Just not economically feasible, really, for sunflowers in 2024. Corn, U.S. yield was up 1.1% despite the trimming of the crop due to drought. North Dakota yield up 4.2%. And again, a lot of the central and western Corn Belt did pretty well. We saw record yields coming out of neighboring South Dakota. Iowa, 211 bushels per acre. Illinois, even better than that at 217. North Dakota, respectable 149, up 4% from last year. But again, drought really trimmed prospects in the eastern Corn Belt, the mid-Atlantic, and the southeast. Relatively minor production areas, sure, but overall, just up 1.1%, a record, but when you consider the trend, really kind of a disappointing year for corn overall with that late drought impact. Looking at some other commodities, alfalfa, hay, such an important part of North Dakota, number 3 state for alfalfa. U.S. yield was up almost 15%, North Dakota helping that along with a 12% increase. Again, despite some of the drought issues, especially in the west and the south. Hay, not including alfalfa, U.S. yield up 10% from 2023. North Dakota yield up 11%. And then spring wheat, much better year than 2023. North Dakota up a whopping 21.6%. U.S. yield 14% up. And then winter wheat, not a whole lot of acreage here, but I'll mention it anyway. North Dakota yield was down 3.6%, U.S. yield up 2%. And then it's kind of interesting to look at the spring wheat numbers because you had the record in North Dakota coming in at 59 bushels per acre, but neighboring Montana did poorly there with a much lower yield compared to the previous year. So somewhere in there was a dividing line where things got markedly worse. A couple more crops to focus on for 24. Durum yield, good year for durum overall. U.S. yield up 6, North Dakota 27% up from 2023. Barley also did well both in the U.S. and North Dakota. Again, North Dakota absolutely essential to both of those crops as well as many others. Durum, once again, we saw that east-west divide with North Dakota with a record 47, up 27%, but neighboring Montana just 23 bushels per acre, down more than a quarter from 2023. Don't want to leave out the sugar beet folks and the vegetable growers. The sugar beets, U.S. yield was pretty flat, but North Dakota up 9%. A winter like this that we're having now, much better for storage than previously when I know the technology is improving on how to store the beets and climate control them, but when you have a mild winter like we had before, that's tough on the storage. And then finally, durum wheat yield. There's again the divide between North Dakota and Montana. Record yield from North Dakota, 47, just 23 from Montana. Sorry, I went the wrong way with that. And then finally, I'm going to talk about cattle just a little bit. Not a huge endeavor for the state when you compare it to the national numbers, whether you're looking at cattle, beef cows, or other animals. But we will be getting into lambing and calving season here soon, so I know that's on the forefront of some of the producers' minds. And I want to talk about how it relates to drought. As a drought monitor author since the late 90s for the 25 years of the product, obviously the drought situation near and dear to my heart. I'm one of the 8 authors drawing these lines for the drought monitor. For a lot of 2024, we had very little drought in the heart of the growing season. Look at June, look at July, just patches of dryness and some of the lower end drought categories. But as the year went on, we got into August and September, the drought really came coming back, and that could be a factor for 2025 as we've reduced soil moisture heading into the cold season. The way the drought monitor works is that we base it on percentile rankings. So when you see a D4, all the indicators that we use, whether it's precipitation, soil moisture, stream flow, vegetation health, or whatever we're using, we look at that as a percentile ranking. So when you get to a D4, that's the type of drought you would expect to see every once to 50 to 100 years. We like to see a convergence of those indicators into that level. You don't always get that agreement. So when you get into the D3s and D4s, that's pretty significant drought. D4, 1 in 50 to 100 year drought. A D3, like we currently see in parts of western North Dakota, that's like a 1 in 20 to 1 in 50 year drought. So we pay careful attention to when we're drawing these drought lines that we try to match up with historical frequencies. So that is significant drought currently in western North Dakota. Also across the southern tier of the state, we've got some pretty dry soils there as well. No drought really confined to central and northeastern North Dakota at this time. We're getting pretty close to the start of the growing season. That is a consideration that we have very little soil moisture to fall back on the further west and south you go through the region. Currently, for the U.S. as a whole, 64% of the country is either dry or in drought, and almost 40% of the country is experiencing some degree of drought. Most of the drought now focused in the southwest through parts of southern Texas and West Texas. Another big area, northern Rockies through the northern plains, and then still some patches of drought in the east and the Great Lakes region. During the 2024 growing season, this was the trend from mid-May to late October. So remember, we had very little drought in North Dakota through June and July, and then the wheels fell off in terms of precipitation. So a lot of the northern plains turned markedly drier with 1 to 2 to 3 category reductions or deterioration in drought. That's also true for the southeastern plains, the mid-south, eastern corn belt. And so all those areas much drier by the time we got to late October. And that's where we went into the winter, the cold season, with limited soil moisture heading into 2025. It does not help that we've had a snow drought in much of the upper Midwest and northern plains. There has been more snow this winter in New Orleans, Pensacola, and Beaumont, Port Arthur, Texas, than there has been in Lincoln, Nebraska, and Omaha, Nebraska. 1 inch of snow so far this entire winter in eastern Nebraska, less than 5 inches so far in Des Moines, Iowa. And even here, we're running less than half of normal for snowfall accumulations. So that doesn't help. We went into fall, winter with dry soils. We haven't had much snow. So we need spring moisture to bring things back up to a more normal level before we get into the growing season. In the last 10 weeks, early November to mid-January, we have seen some improvement in a lot of areas. It's a good time of year to replenish soil moisture if you can get the storminess. Problem here is a lot of the snow that has fallen has been powdery, it's blowing around, it's not much, and so there's not much moisture content. So we've really not improved the situation much over the last 2 to 3 months here. Areas like in the eastern Corn Belt have seen improvement. Southeastern Plains, Mid-South, all doing better. The Northwest is doing better. The Southwest is not. Looking at the history of drought in North Dakota, just based on the U.S. Drought Monitor, I've kind of highlighted some of the big droughts over the years. There was a period of extended drought in the early 21st century, but a lot of the drought categories were relatively low. We did have significant drought 2006 through 2008 with some breaks in that drought coverage. 2012 wasn't horrible here compared to other parts of the country. That was a continental scale drought, and it did reach into this area, and it was hot, but the overall drought coverage was not as significant as the previous drought a few years earlier. 2017 certainly shows up. 2021 really shows up. And we've never really completely vanquished the drought that came on a few years ago. We've had some better periods embedded in that, but it seems like we've been kind of chronically dry since 2021 if you look at the drought monitor. One thing the U.S. Drought Monitor is tied to that I have nothing to do with other than the fact that I draw the drought lines is livestock forage disaster program. So I told you I'd come back to the livestock angle. And since it was enshrined in the Farm Bill in 2008, LFP payouts nationally over that 15, 16-year period have totaled $13 billion. So we recognize the importance of the drought monitor for the farming community, especially the livestock producers. Those numbers, of course, don't include other programs that have been tied to the drought monitor depiction, such as the pandemic era emergency relief program, that doled out money to the row crop producers here. So overall, the big years for LFP payouts topping $1.5 billion in 2013, 2022, and 2023. And so it kind of follows the drought coverage, very much so. And again, $13 billion in that program history. I'm hearing that there may be some modifications to the LFP formula in the new Farm Bill that might smooth out that little awkward step between 8 weeks at D2, 1 monthly payment, and then any time at D3, 3 monthly payments. That's been a kind of a consternation for the drought monitor folks because everybody wants to make that jump from 1 to 3. So I think they may smooth that formula out. Stay tuned to the next Farm Bill for that. Here's how that money, that $13 billion has been broken up. North Dakota, the recipient of $223 million for the livestock producers over the last 15, 16 years. The big numbers come in from further south. Look at Texas, Oklahoma, both over $2 billion. Kansas, over $1 billion. North Dakota payments, again, as I mentioned, 2012, not too significant on the high-end drought levels. Only about $13 million going to the state from that drought. That did not match up to 2008 and certainly didn't compare to 17 or 21. All right, here we go. We're going to break into the forecast in the last couple of minutes here. We finally have gotten into a La Nina situation. We were in a La Nina watch for almost a year. I think the first watch came out February of 2024. We kept waiting. Finally, December of 2024, we're into La Nina. So we're focusing on this one little area of the equatorial Pacific. When that water gets cold enough, it starts affecting wind patterns, atmospheric patterns across the globe, including North America. So here's a recent sea surface temperature anomaly showing that La Nina zone where that cool water is affecting atmospheric patterns downstream. The forecast is for a weak and short-lived La Nina, but it is influencing North American weather patterns. The cold waves of December, January, and now into February certainly are related to the jet stream disruptions from La Nina, as well as the southwestern drought, Southern California fires, and some of the stormy weather we're starting to see across the Ohio Valley into the eastern Corn Belt. We expect to be neutral again by later in the spring into the summer, so neutral conditions expected to return for the growing season. The seasonal drought outlook through the end of April indicating, unfortunately for this area in the north central U.S., that if you're in drought now, it is expected to be still there at the end of April. If you go to the west, into the northern Rockies, if you go east into the Great Lakes region, likely to see some improvement in the drought situation there. Another area expecting ongoing or developing drought would be the southern tier of the country, Southern California through the Gulf Coast. So looking ahead to the rest of winter and spring, well, the atmospheric block that brought our dry late summer and fall has, well, I'll say shifted more than broken down. It's kind of shifted away. So we are expecting La Nina to contribute to an active winter storm track, not unlike what we're going to see later this week, where we get storms moving through the Ohio Valley and on into the northeast. Expect ongoing drought in the southwest. Continued episodic cold outbreaks, especially northern plains into the eastern U.S., not unlike what we have outside today. Here is the National Weather Service outlook for February, March, April. You can see the impact of the episodic cold outbreaks, northern plains and northwest. These are in probabilities. Just because you see blue or red on the map for the temperature doesn't mean 100% likelihood of cold or warm. The odds are tilted in that direction. So do expect a likelihood of below normal temperatures for the Dakotas and points west, not unlike what we have seen over the last several weeks. For precipitation, 2 bullseyes of wetness, but unfortunately not in the Dakotas. We see that storm track expected to be active from, say, the northern Mississippi Delta on through the eastern Corn Belt, interior northeast, another pocket in the northwest. So that's kind of the outlook for the rest of winter into spring. Don't think we're going to see any meaningful drought relief through at least April of 2025. That brings us to the beginning of the growing season. How are we looking? Well, I guess that's good for field work, maybe not good for having a good year unless we get a wet summer, right? So La Nina fading away, that's probably good news. Neutral conditions, as I mentioned. Climate models are showing a northwesterly dip in the jet stream through the north central United States, late spring into summer. I'll show what that means in a minute. But there may be a ridge building in the west that could try to shift eastward. A lot of the climate models, and they look at more than 24 of them, are suggesting this western ridge trying to build eastward. How that plays out in these probability forecasts, look for conditions that are not particularly hot in the upper Midwest. Equal chances, meaning above, below, or near normal temperatures are equally likely, but you see some heat starting to possibly build further west. Look at the precipitation pattern. This is May, June, July. I'm a little concerned about the ridge in the west if it tries to work its way eastward. Kind of divides North Dakota right up and down there. So you get to western North Dakota, odds start to tilt towards drier than normal conditions. That happens to be where we have some D2 and D3 right now. So I am concerned about moisture, western North Dakota and points west. Hopefully further east, it'll be more normal conditions. Temperatures may not be a problem, at least early in the growing season. As we move one more season here, I'll look at the late summer into the end of the growing season, beginning of the harvest season. And so neutral, so not much skill in precipitation forecasting, But still, I think we'll see enhanced odds of drier than normal condition parts of the northern plains. Potentially that trough, that northwesterly flow may deepen as we get into late summer. So again, heat may not be a concern, especially further east you go. How that translates into the forecast, August, September, October, a lot of the heat seems to be pushed down to the east, the south, or even the west. So again, hopefully not a hot summer upcoming if we can just get some moisture. So that's going to be the real wild card. How much moisture can we get to overcome the antecedent drought and the lack of snowfall this winter? So yeah, a little concern for drought, more so as you drive west from here. And that's how it's looking for our forecast for the spring, rest of the winter, spring, and summer. And I'll leave you with this last slide. Typical impacts from La Nina. This doesn't mean 100% chance. Even in our highest La Nina probabilities, you get about a 70 to 80% likelihood of these actual anomalies happening. We're checking off some of the boxes. Southwestern drought in the United States, for example. Some of the problems that they're having right now in Brazil as they move into their second crop or winter crop corn, which is the majority corn crop, some real drought issues in southern Brazil and northeastern Argentina. So that's kind of checking off the box there for La Nina. Those are some important ones for American agriculture, obviously, when you start talking about the weather in Brazil and Argentina. So we'll continue to monitor that as we move through. They're on obviously the opposite calendar. We're February, they're in late August, so they're getting into their winter season or their late summer season at this point. So anyway, I will leave you with that, and hopefully we have time for some questions from Clinton's magic machine here.
Let's give him a round of applause. All right, we got some great questions here. A couple I want to start with. So this is a question. I don't know this, but I'm not a meteorologist, haven't done this. Just play one on TV. The validity of the Gleisberg cycle, which is an 89-year drought cycle, 1847, 1936, is 2025 the next year. As you look at these cycles, can we start to make sense of them?
Yeah, so I'm not a climate scientist. There is so much I do not understand. I pretend I know about weather and a little bit about climate, but everything from solar cycles to solar radiation, it's very complex and confusing. That's why I don't try to predict where this warming trend is going to go down the road, because we just don't know a whole lot. I've heard of the cycle, and I don't think it's really fair to just say 89 years, that's automatic drought. There's so many other things going on right now. We have a situation right now where the oceans are very, very warm. That is obviously contributing to our above normal global temperatures right now. And it really makes it, one thing we have seen a lot of in recent years is blocking patterns in the spring and fall. And that's where you get stuck in a pattern where it gets too wet or too cold, too warm, too hot, and too dry. And it stays for a month or two. And I don't think that type of thing you can't even predict more than a few months ahead with that kind of stuff. So I really hesitate to talk about 89-year cycles,
right,
especially given the changes that we've undergone in our lifetimes with warming and wetter climate than we had 50 years ago.
As you talk about this and some of the shifts that we've seen, do you think we'll see significant shifts in U.S. weather patterns in the next 15 years? Are there indicators that we may see some shifts?
Yeah, I think the thing I would point out is that we do see more, I feel like, extreme weather events. Some of that may be due to the blocking that I just referenced, where we do get stuck in patterns, especially in the swing seasons, the spring and the fall. And so that leads to more extreme, some of these heavier rainfall or snowfall events. Spring flooding can be a factor with that. So yeah, I think it's going to be a wild ride in politics and weather over the next couple of decades. That's my prediction.
All right, last question here. You showed us at the beginning with the climate slowly warming just a little bit here. Does that seem like a cyclical trend, or is it something else? Or are we learning as we go here?
Yeah, I hate to make a prediction because We had that net cooling from the 30s through the 70s. We've seen a 50-year warming trend since then. But the way we've warmed is weird, and I showed that in the beginning where it's like it's off season, so we get the winter, and it's nighttime. So it's like a weird thing like that. I really hesitate to go forward from here and try to hazard a guess. The Earth climate system is obviously smarter than I am, and I can take it. I don't want to Monday morning quarterback it too much until we're out in the future and look back. I just don't know where we're going with this.
Absolutely. Let's give Brad a round of applause. Thank you, Brad.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.